Oxford University, with its 800-year-old legacy, had never encountered such an intense and profound silence. Professor Harrington had just announced, Africa has made no contribution to human civilization. Rising from his seat, Ibrahim Traoré stood as 500 scholars held their collective breath. Yet no one could have foreseen that the words he would speak in the next 10 minutes would go viral, ultimately ending the professor's academic career. The Sheldonian theater was packed that March afternoon. The event was expected to be a typical lecture focused on 21st-century global leadership, featuring a range of scholars and international leaders. Among the invited guests was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, who had been included in Oxford's African Leadership Series. He sat quietly in the front row, dressed modestly in a dark suit, jotting down notes while different speakers shared their perspectives on development, democracy, and global cooperation. At 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington took the stage. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and glasses framed in thin wire. Known for his extensive published work on European history and Western civilization, he was a man who commanded academic respect. His introduction was filled with accolades: a Rhodes Scholar, the author of 12 books, and the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates. As Harrington began his lecture on the roots of modern civilization, his tone was assured, almost dismissive, as if the conclusions he intended to share were indisputable. When we study the cornerstones of human progress, Harrington began, his voice resonating through the historic hall, we notice a distinct pattern: mathematics from Greece, Roman law, German philosophy, and industrial breakthrough from Britain. He paused, glancing over his glasses at the audience. The foundation of what we understand as civilization is unmistakably Western. Some members of the audience shifted in their seats, clearly uneasy, but Harrington pressed on, confident in an environment that had long tolerated such narratives. 20 minutes into the lecture, he made the statement that would redefine his professional life. Now, some may ask what other regions have contributed. Asia brought us paper and gunpowder, and the Americas had advanced calendar systems. But Africa, he stopped, a subtle smirk forming. I defy anyone here to name one major contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. That continent has been a beneficiary of civilization, not a source of it. A heavy, loaded silence filled the room. In the front row, Ibrahim Traoré gently closed his notebook and laid his pen beside it. Around him, several African students and faculty remained frozen, torn between fury and the daunting pressure of speaking against a senior scholar in Oxford's most revered auditorium. The silence hung thick with tension until Traoré raised his hand. Yes. Harrington acknowledged him, with barely veiled irritation, clearly not anticipating dissent. Traoré stood up slowly, every motion calm and intentional. Professor Harrington, he began, his voice projecting clearly even without using the microphone, I would like to address your claim, if that's allowed. Harrington's smirk grew. By all means, Mr. He pretended not to recall Traoré's identity, despite the president having been formally introduced at the start of the session. Ibrahim Traoré, he replied plainly, leaving out any mention of his presidential status. And I accept your challenge. A wave of anticipation spread through the audience. A few people quietly began recording on their phones, sensing that something important was about to happen. Harrington waved his hand dismissively toward the front. Please, enlighten us. But kindly stick to historical evidence rather than indulge in romanticized nationalism, he said, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. Traoré walked up to the podium at an unhurried, steady pace. He held a plain leather folder, which he set carefully on the lectern. For a few moments, he stood still, gazing first at the audience, then directly at Harrington. Professor, he began, before I respond to your challenge, may I pose a question to you? In all your extensive studies, have you ever visited the manuscript archives of Timbuktu? Have you ever studied the mathematical writings of the Dune people? Have you examined the metallurgy of the Haya people in Tanzania? Harrington dismissed him with a flick of his hand. Ancient mud huts and tribal myths don't amount to civilization, Mr. Traoré. We're discussing advancements in human history, not anthropological trivia. Gasps rippled through the audience at his blatant disrespect. Yet Traoré remained composed. He opened his folder and drew out a single document. Then let's begin with something that may be more familiar to you, he said, holding up a photocopy of an ancient artifact. This is an image of the Lebombo bone, found in what is now Eswatini. It's 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the oldest known mathematical markings in the world, 29 carved notches representing lunar tracking. Mathematics didn't originate in Greece, Professor. Its earliest traces are in Africa. Harrington's smug expression began to waver, though he quickly responded. Tally marks aren't exactly Pythagorean theory, he scoffed. Traore produced another document. In that case, allow me to introduce the Ishango bone, discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's 20,000 years old and shows knowledge of prime numbers, as well as multiplication and division. That's nearly 19,000 years before Greek mathematics. He paused deliberately, letting the facts take hold. But if you're looking for something more recent, he continued, let's turn to the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. It housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 1100s, while Oxford was still a group of taverns. By now, the hall was completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Traore, each word delivered with calm assurance but growing intensity. You mentioned Roman law, he went on. Shall we explore that next? The Constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which implemented a system of checks and balances, was established 300 years before the U.S. Constitution. Or consider the Buganda Parliament, which operated a sophisticated form of democratic governance while most of Europe remained under the rule of absolute monarchs. You mentioned philosophy from Germany. Traore continued, now speaking with full confidence and control. But have you ever read the writings of Ziri Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian thinker who developed concept of rational thought and human rights long before the European Enlightenment? His student, Walter Hayward, authored ethical treatises that stand on equal footing with anything produced in Europe during the same era. Of course, they wrote in GZ, not Latin, so perhaps, in your view, that disqualifies them. Harrington attempted to interrupt. These are isolated examples. He began, but Traore calmly raised his hand, and to the surprise of many, Harrington fell silent. Isolated? Traore repeated. Let me explain what isolation really means. Isolation is when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, preserved the world's knowledge while the ancestors of Oxford's founders still lived in mud dwellings. It's when African scholars calculated the circumference of the earth while Europeans thought it was flat. You asked for contributions to civilization. Traore's voice lifted slightly for the first time. Let's talk about medicine. The first recorded cataract surgery took place in Mali in the 14th century. The first caesarean section in which both mother and child survived was performed in Uganda in 1879, using methods that European medicine wouldn't adopt for another half-century. The earliest form of vaccination, not Jenner's cowpox experiment, but variolation against smallpox, practiced in West Africa and brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans. He produced another document from his folder. Architecture. The sound design of Great Zimbabwe exceeds even modern acoustic engineering. The Nubian pyramids were constructed before Egypt's. The monolithic churches of the Libela were carved from single blocks of volcanic rock with such precision that today's engineers still struggle to understand how it was done. But perhaps you've never heard of these achievements because they don't support your idea of Africa as primitive. The atmosphere in the hall had noticeably shifted. Students who had been lounging in their seats were now fully alert, taking notes. A number of professors were nodding in agreement, some visibly uneasy, others as if learning these facts for the first time. Harrington's demeanor had changed, no longer smug, but defensive, even visibly shaken. But Traore wasn't done. Let's turn to metallurgy, he continued, his tone now carrying the quiet power of undeniable truth. The higher people in what is now Tanzania were producing carbon steel in high-temperature furnaces 2,000 years ago, a process that Europe wouldn't develop until the Industrial Revolution. And the Benin bronzes? So intricately crafted that when Europeans first encountered them, they refused to believe Africans were capable of such work. They came up with stories about lost Portuguese artisans to explain it. In agriculture, Africans domesticated crops like pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They engineered sophisticated irrigation systems across the Sahel that sustained urban populations in the hundreds of thousands, at a time when Europe was still deep in the Dark Ages. The terrace farming practices of the Dune people have supported communities for more than 1,000 years in environments where European farming fails after just one season. Traoré paused, fixing his eyes on Harrington, who now appeared visibly flustered, beads of sweat on his forehead despite the theater's cool air. But perhaps most critically, Professor, Traoré continued, let's speak about you been to, the philosophical principle of I am because we are. While European philosophy focused on individualism, conquest, and separation, African philosophy developed systems centered on restorative justice, mutual responsibility, and the inherent dignity of every human being, concepts the so-called civilized world is only just beginning to appreciate. He lowered his voice slightly, but it carried even more weight. The real tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traoré said, is not that Africa made no contribution to civilization. The tragedy is that academics like you have spent generations actively erasing, disregarding, and ridiculing those contributions. When Timbuktu's libraries were thriving, housing more written knowledge than any European institution, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers tracked the movements of the stars, you labeled us superstitious. When our surgeons performed complex medical procedures, you dismissed them as witchcraft. He reached into his folder and drew out one final page. This, he said, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, the very founder of the scholarship that may have paid for your education. In it, he states directly that African history must be deliberately erased in order to justify colonization. Your ignorance, Professor, Traoré said evenly, is not accidental. It is a result of a long, methodical campaign to erase African contributions to humanity, and you've been complicit in that erasure for 47 years. The theater was completely still. Not a sound. Harrington stood off to the side of the stage, opening his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Traoré, however, was not yet done. I could go on, he said. I could speak for hours. I could tell you about the Dune people's astronomical knowledge, how they understood the existence of Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could confirm it. I could describe the intricate fractal geometry in African village design and artwork, patterns that predate Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the call and response rhythm of African music became the backbone of jazz, blues, rock, and nearly every form of modern popular music. He paused, then calmly closed his folder. But I believe I've made my point, he concluded. The real question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The real question is, why is it that you, a professor at one of the world's most esteemed institutions, know none of this? He looked directly at Harrington, holding the silence. Oh, Weiss, Traoré added quietly, why you do know it, and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman seated near the front. The knowledge of the Dune people, along with the healing practices of traditional African medical experts, became recognized as a legitimate subject of academic research. 1 year later, Oxford University revealed a new statue in its central quadrangle. It was not a likeness of Ibrahim Traoré. He had respectfully declined the tribute. Instead, the statue honored Ahmed Baba Ultimbukti, the 16th century African scholar who authored over 1,600 works on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics, educating generations while Oxford was still in its earliest stages. The inscription at the base read, "Knowledge has no color. Wisdom has no continent. Truth belongs to all humanity." Years later, in an interview, Traoré looked back on that pivotal day at Oxford. I didn't arrive intending to give that speech, he admitted. But when Professor Harrington made his claim, I thought of all the African children who might hear such words and accept them as true. I thought of the brilliant African minds across history whose contributions had been erased or taken. I couldn't stay silent. He continued, the real tragedy wasn't just what one uninformed professor said. It's that his beliefs were tolerated for decades in an institution that claims to stand for truth and knowledge. How many students sat in his classes over 47 years, absorbing that misinformation? How many of them went on to positions of power, carrying those biases with them? That's why I had to speak, not to shame him, but to break that cycle. When asked whether he felt his response had been too severe, Traoré shook his head. For centuries, African history has been written by those who enslaved us, colonized us, and exploited us. They had no incentive to recognize our accomplishments. When your history has been denied for that long, speaking the truth isn't harsh, it's essential. Professor Harrington had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose not to. I just chose not to let that ignorance go unchallenged. The event, soon referred to globally as the Traoré moment, is now studied in universities across the world as a watershed in the academic treatment of African history. It stands as a powerful reminder. True knowledge requires humility, curiosity, and the courage to question deeply embedded assumptions. It showed the world that sometimes the strongest answer to prejudice is not outrage or confrontation, but truth delivered with dignity and grounded in undeniable evidence. And today, in classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, teachers begin their lessons on African history with a truth that should never have been debated. Africa is not just part of human civilization. It is where human civilization began. The silence that fell over Oxford University on that March afternoon was more than just a collapse of a single professor's career. It marked the start of a long overdue reckoning with who gets to tell history, whose voices are elevated, and whose legacies are remembered.